Hello and welcome. Let's continue our discussion on data types and talk about a couple more. In this lecture, we are going to talk about the enum data type and char data type. So, enums items are a data type that allows a programmer to define a variable and specify the valid values that could be stored into that variable. So, an enum is a very powerful. It's actually specifying a data type. It is a keyword enum, but you can basically have your own data type that includes certain values only. So for example, you could create a variable named my color. And if it's a certain enum type, you can set it so that it only includes or only can be assigned values of primary colors such as red, yellow, or blue, and then no other values can be assigned to it. The compiler will give you an error. And so it's a sort of like a data type that you can specify, that you can create, but so you are going to have to define the data types and then you are going to have to create variables of that type. So enum is the keyword. So the first thing you have to do if you want to use this enum data type is you have to define that enum type and give it a name, just an identifier, just like a variable name. And the way that you do it, it is you are going to use the enum keyword. And then after the enum keyword, you are going to provide a name like an identifier. And then after the identifier, you are going to put all of the list of values inside curly braces. And you are basically saying that this enum can only be these values. And then when you want to use the enum later, you create a variable of that type enum. So let's see this in action. Here I am defining an enum type called primary color. So I have the enum keyword, and then I have my name of my enum, which is primary color, and then I am defining all the values for the type. And you will see that they are enclosed inside curly braces, the left curly braces and the right curly braces. In this case, we have a type of enum named primary color that can only hold values of red, yellow, and blue. And it can't store anything else if you try to assign a value to primary color, or if you try to use the primary color data type and you try to assign a variable value to something else, it would not work. So this is just how we define it. We first have to define the enum, we then have to use it again. Definition is just saying this is what it is. And so what we are seeing here is we have a primary color in white. It can be as red, yellow, and blue. So variable that are declared to be primary color type can only be assigned the values red, yellow, and blue. Inside the program, no other values will work. So again, the first step defining it, the second step is using it. First step defining, second step using it. So after we have defined it, we can then declare a variable of this type, primary color in the way. The variable now is we still use the enum keyword. We then actually have the name of the enum that we specified when we defined it. And then at the very end, we follow that with a variable list. So here is an example. We have in enum, we use the enum keyword. We have the name of the enum that we want to use, which is the one we just created called primary color. And then we just have names. So here we have two enums of type primary color, my color and Greg's color. So again, this is where we are using the enum. We have already defined what the enum can be, just red, yellow, or blue. Now, we are saying we have two variables named my color and Greg's color that can only contain one of those three values, can't contain anything else. So here we are declaring a variable primary color, and again this is defining two variables, my color and Greg's color, to be of the type of primary color, which is enum type. The only permissible value that can be assigned to these two variables are red, yellow, and blue. So we could say my color equals red. So that's perfectly valid. We could not say my color equals green. That would not work because those values are not valid for that enum type. We could not say my color equals Jason because my color can only contain three values of the primary color enum type. So this is a very powerful data types because you are essentially defining your own data types that can contain only certain values. Another example here would be if we create an enum that is of type month, and here we are saying that month can be only be equal to January, February, March, April, June, May, July, August, September, October, November, December. Again, this is the definition. This is where we are saying that the valid values are. If we were to go and use month, we would create a variable called enum month, and then whatever name you could to give it, and then we can assign to that name any of these valid months, January through December. So that is how you use an enum. Now, under the hood, as far as how are implemented in the C programming language, is there really represented by numbers. So the compiler actually treats enumeration identifiers as integer constant. So the first name in the list that you define, if you were to try to print out the values, it would be a 0. All this is saying again is how are they defined. If you were to display the output, what are the actual values? So what this means is that if we have in a month, this month, we created a new variables of type enum month. and then we say this month equals to February. This month is actually going to be equal to an integer, but we can still compare it and use it to compare it against frequency, February. But if you were to print out this month to the console, this month would actually be an integer value corresponding to when it was defined in the list. So in this case, February would be 1 because this month, the second one is the list, February, right? So if we go back, if you remember when we defined it, the second one is February. And you should notice that it's 1 even though it's the second one, because what that means is the list start is 0. So January would be 0. February would be 1, March would be 2, and 4, so forth. And this is important because you can then compare it against, as well as comparing against actual values like February. Now, if you want to have a specific integer value associated with the enumeration identifier, you can explicitly assign something using the assignment of data. When you actually define the type, so for example, here, if we define a new enum of type direction, and we are saying that the valid values for direction are up, down, left, and right, you will see that the third value left actually has an equals, that saying that left is going to be equal to 10. So in this case, our enum type direction is defined with the values up, down, left, and right. Those are the only valid values that you can assign. Variables of this type is going to be equal to 0 because it's the first element in the list definition. 1 is going to be equal to down because it's the second element. Again, it starts at 0. 10 is going to be equal to left. It is not going to be equal to 2 because we explicitly assign it to equal to 10. So left is going to be 10 because that's what we put in our definition. And then right is going to be equal to 11 because it's going to be immediately the one next after it. It's the next one. So if we had another value, then there would be 12. So you can explicitly assign values if you want to. But again, what this is important is because when you do comparisons, or if you print out the values, you just have to know that the genomes are actually represented as integers inside the system. But you can still actually use February, March, January. When you sign to your enum, when you actually compare those values against another value, you can use January, February, March. It still allows you to use those nice names. So we are going to have a nice little assignment or challenge on enums. So you can become a little more familiar with it. But the point here is how can you create an enum type? And then how can you create variables of that type and assign values? And again, it's nice because you can control what's being assigned. If you don't want direction to be assigned, right corner, you just define up, down, left, and right. Another important data type that I want to discuss is char. Depending on how you pronounce it, we have talked mainly about numeric data types. We already talked. We now talk about the enum. Char represents a single character such as the letter A, the digit character 6 or semicolon. And what you see here is the single quotes. The reason we know their character is even though one is a number is because it's in single quotes. So anything inside single quotes in a program is referred to as a character data type. And typically the characters will be alphanumeric characters like A, B, C, D, A, F, G, but they can still be actual numbers or other characters on the keyboard. And you can also declare character variable to be assigned. Unsigned, it just means that they cannot be negative. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense. But what it's telling the compiler when you have an unsigned character is that it's only a positive number. Because remember, characters can also be represented as numbers in the ASCII table. We are going to talk about that in a second. But we will talk about, you also don't want to confuse the character data type with character strings. A character data type is just a single character inside a single quotes. We have a whole other sections where we are going to talk about strings. This will be a sequence of characters, a number of characters. So don't get character or char confused with character, string, or if you want to declare a character and use it, you can simply specify the data type, char, and then the identifier. So in this example, we have char that's declaring a variable named broiled type char. When we assign to that variable, we put the value inside single quotes. So broiled equals t is perfectly fine. If we try to say boiled equals t and t is not inside quotes, that's not okay because t is a variable and that would not be valid unless t is also of type char. Here we have royal equal double quotes also. Here we have boiled equal to t double quotes. That's not valid because double quotes means it's a string, which we'll talk more about, but that's not valid. So if you omit those single quotes, the compiler is just going to think that t is the name of a variable and it's not going to work. If you use double quotes, it's going to think you are using a string. As I mentioned, you can also use numerical codes to assign values for character, and it will just use the ASCII table. So the ASCII table is how characters are represented as numbers in the computer. So there's this whole table, and basically, if you assign a number to a character type, it's going to think you are assigning the ASCII value. So what it's going to do, it's going to assign 65 to grade ASCII. It's going to look 65 up in the ASCII table, and it's going to be the equivalent of whatever character that is. And you have to look in the ASCII table to see what that character is. But I know B is like 48. So again, this is the way the computer represents certain characters by numbers. So you can't assign numbers to characters. They are just going to be converted to single characters based on what they are in ASCII table. Escape characters, this is a special term that you are going to hear about, where basically it's a special character that represent an action in the C programming language. So for example, if you can have a special character that represent the backspace, or special character that represent the new line, or a special character that represent the terminal value, you can represent these actions by using basically an awkward symbol like a character inside single quotes. And I'm going to give you some examples. These are also called escape sequence. These are special characters that represent actions. So escape sequence are also enclosed in single quotes when they are assigned to a character variable. You often see these escape sequence inside of strings as well to represent an action. So for example, if we have character x equals single quotes backslash n, you will notice a lot of the escape characters start with the backslash. But backslash n is a single character, and it looks kind of strange what it represents in a program. Is it represent a new line? So if you were to try to print out that character as output, it would not actually print out backslash n. It would print out a new line. You would see a new line, print it out. So char x will represent this character. And if you were to print variable x, it would just advances the next line. And there's a number of different escape sequences. Here is a nice little table I took from a primary book that represent all the escape characters that you can use that represent actions. So we mentioned the backslash, and that's new line. R is a carrier return, backslash V is a vertical tab, backslash T, I think it is a horizontal tab. So let me give you some example of this, and also give you some examples of enum inside of our nice code blocks editor. Now we are going towards code blocks. So we here have familiar program with our main method, and enum, again, an enum is nice because you can decide what values are assigned to it. But there's two steps. When you create an enum, you have to define the type, and then you have to create the variable of that type. And you use the enum keyword for both. So if I wanted to create a new type enum, and I want to name have the enum equal to some values, for example, I could create an enum of type, let's say A. Enum type gender. We see enum gender, and then all we do is we use the squarely brackets, not to be confused with the square brackets, squarely bracket, and we did it. Then define the list of values that gender can be. Basically, it can just be a male, and then we separate it with commas and then a female. And then we end it with semicolon. And what this is saying is we have a new type called gender. It's a type enum. The only values that can be assigned to variables of this type is male and female. If you want to use the enum, we can create a new variable. We just have to say enum, the names of the type gender, and then we can just say my gender, right? And that's how we declaring the variable. We declare variable my gender, but we have not assigned or initialized any values. The only values that we can assign it to are male or female. So we could say my gender equals male, and that's valid. And if we were to go and compile, this would be fine. There's no errors. And if we tried to assign something else, like let's just say we want to assign it a string, let's try saying we want to assign in a number 44. Now, if we try to build this, you will see that it would okay without an error because it was not an int. But if we try to put it in a string or something would be more valuable. It's going to say incompatible types when assigning. So there's an error there. It's pretty hard to see, but basically we are not allowed to assign it a string here because it's not the right type 44. You can only assign it male or female. And then again, if you were to try to see what this is represented in terms of integers, so we can say male. We can then actually compare it to other variables. So we can create another enum gender type of another gender. You always want to use good naming conventions here in case of enum. Make sure we spell correctly. That's when we can say female god, and then we can actually say create a boolean value to see true or false. Could say boolean is male, and we could say that's going to be equal to male equals female. I'm sorry, not male equals female, but my gender equals to female. Another gender, this would actually return false because my gender is not equal to another gender. My gender is equal to male another gender is equal to female, we get set to be false value and zero value. We can also, though, actually see the values of enums by printing them out. And what we'll notice is that if we were to actually print out the values of the enum gender, which we have not learned how to print out variables yet, but we can do something like print f. You would notice that gender. My gender is actually going to be equal to 0 because that's the first in the list. Another gender is going to be equal to 1, so that's pretty neat. I also want to talk a little bit about chars in our examples. Remember, we can create chars, single characters with the variables name. We just use the char type and then we say something like char by character and we can equal to anything in single quotes. It can be whatever, we can even assign values, which will represent ASCII numbers in the table. But what this is nice is you can assign it to escape characters and represent specific actions like in \n. And if we were to try to use this or print it out, it would print a new line feed. So we could do printf, and we could say printf, we have to do something like %c, which we are going to talk about in our next lecture, and then print out my character. And that would actually display to the screen a new line, just a line feed. So if we were to build this and we ought to run it, what we actually see is output is just a new line. So you kind of see it up there. There's a new line there, so it is a specific action. You are not printing out any output, but we'll go through more examples of this. What I was trying to demonstrate here is this nice concept of an enum and characters and escape sequence. Escape characters. A great way to learn a lot of this stuff is to just play around the type code inside the IDE and see what it does. But to supplement this, I will